It started when I moved into a little apartment complex last fall. The building was older but had charm, worn brick, ivy climbing up the walls. It was quiet, cheap, and seemed like the perfect place to get my life together. One neighbor stood out immediately, Mrs. Kelsey. She lived below me, an older woman in her 70s. She always wore a gray cardigan and waved whenever she saw me, flashing a big smile. I thought she was just lonely. I should have trusted that nagging feeling I got every time she smiled. The first weird thing happened a couple of weeks in. One night I came home from work and found my front door unlocked. My stomach sank. I always lock my door. But when I stepped inside, nothing seemed out of place. I checked every room. No one was there. Still, the apartment didn't feel right. There was this faint smell in the air, something musty, like old flowers left to rot. It reminded me of the hallway outside Mrs. Kelsey's apartment. I brushed it off. Then other things started happening. My blanket would be folded differently than I'd left it. A glass I didn't remember using would be on the counter. Once I found my kitchen cabinet open. I told myself I was imagining things. But that changed the night I woke up to whispering. It was around 2 a.m. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sound was soft, just a faint hiss. But when I sat up and listened, my heart started pounding. The whispering wasn't outside, it was inside. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The sound was coming from the bathroom. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The whispering stopped. I scanned the room. Nothing. But then I saw the mirror. The steam-covered glass had words scrawled across it. "I see you." I barely slept after that. The next morning, I decided to talk to Mrs. Kelsey. I couldn't shake the feeling she'd seen or heard something. When I knocked on her door, she answered instantly, like she'd been waiting. "Good morning, dear," she said, smiling too wide. Her teeth were yellow, like she drank coffee non-stop but never brushed. "Hi, Mrs. Kelsey," I said. "I was wondering, have you noticed anything weird, like noises or people hanging around?" Her smile twitched. "Oh no, dear. It's such a safe building. I'm sure you're just imagining things." Her tone was so syrupy, so fake, it made my stomach churn. I nodded and left. But as I walked away, I could feel her watching me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Something didn't add up. So I Googled her. I found an article from 7 years ago. Widow found living with husband's decomposing body. The article was about Mrs. Kelsey. Her husband had died in their apartment, and instead of reporting it, she'd kept his body for a year. Neighbors complained about the smell, but she convinced them it was her cooking. When the police broke in, they found her sitting with his rotting hand. I felt sick. Why was she still living here? I went straight to the landlord. I told him everything. The unlocked door, the whispering, the mirror, the fingernails. He looked skeptical but agreed to check the security cameras. When he called me into his office later, his face was pale. He showed me the footage. Mrs. Kelsey. Every night she came up to my door. Sometimes she'd just stand there staring. Other times she'd press her ear against it, whispering. One clip showed her unlocking my door with a key and walking inside. I felt like I was going to throw up. "How does she have a key?" I demanded. "She's been here for decades," he stammered. "I'll change your locks immediately." That night, with the new locks installed, I finally felt a little safer. I double-checked everything before bed. The windows, the deadbolt, even the chain lock. Nothing was getting in. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was the feeling of being watched. My bedroom door, which I had locked, was open, and standing in the doorway was Mrs. Kelsey. Her gray cardigan hung off her thin frame, and her eyes were wild. She was holding a butcher's knife. "Why do you lock me out?" she whispered. "He doesn't like it when you lock me out." I screamed. I threw the lamp at her and it shattered. In the chaos, I ran past her and bolted out the door. I didn't stop until I found another neighbor's door to bang on, begging for help. The police came and took her away. They found horrifying things in her apartment. Photos of me taken through my windows, locks of my hair, and in her freezer, a collection of things she'd stolen from me. Socks, a coffee mug, even an old hairbrush. But the most disturbing thing they found was a spare key to my apartment, hidden under her bed. The landlord swore he had no idea how she got it. They changed the locks again, and for weeks, I tried to convince myself it was over. But last night, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something on the bathroom mirror. 3 words written in the steam. I never left. Moving into your first apartment, it's supposed to be a milestone, right? A fresh start, independence, freedom. That's exactly what I thought when I signed the lease on my charming 1-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburban building. But what I didn't realize was that this seemingly peaceful home held a dark secret. And that secret? It lived right above me. My building was small, just 4 units, and my upstairs neighbor was, well, normal, polite, reserved, the kind of person you exchange a quick hello with but don't really get to know. For months, everything was fine. Quiet nights, a comfy space, my cat curling up on the couch. It was perfect. Or so I thought. It started small. Late at night, I'd hear these faint tapping noises coming from the ceiling. At first, I brushed it off. I mean, people move furniture, walk around, right? But the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. I laughed it off as my imagination. But then, it got weirder. One evening, as I was watching TV, I heard something, muffled whispers coming from the vent. Leaning closer, I could almost make out words. She doesn't know yet. Watching. Careful. I froze. My stomach dropped. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just the TV, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I decided to confront my neighbor. I caught him outside with a trash bag in hand. "Did you hear anything weird last night?" I asked casually, trying not to show how nervous I was. "No," he said quickly. Too quickly. Then, as he turned to leave, I heard him mutter something under his breath. I couldn't make out all of it, but I caught one chilling phrase. So curious, a shame. It felt like he was talking about me. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I'd come home to find my lock slightly loose, like someone had been messing with it. My cat, who loved every corner of the apartment, started avoiding the vents, even hissing at them. And then there was the night I'll never forget. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on my balcony. Remember, I lived on the 2nd floor. I froze, paralyzed with fear. The footsteps didn't retreat. They just stopped. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. That's when I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I bought a hidden camera and placed it in my living room. If someone was coming into my apartment, I'd catch them. The next day, I reviewed the footage, and my worst fear was confirmed. My neighbor, my upstairs neighbor, was inside my apartment. He didn't touch anything. He just stood there, staring, at the couch, at the vent. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and left. But that wasn't the worst part. As I rewatched the footage, I noticed something I hadn't before. His lips were moving, like he was whispering something. I leaned closer to the screen, straining to catch what he was saying. Then it hit me. He was repeating a single phrase over and over. "She's getting too close. She's getting too close." My blood turned to ice. What was I getting too close to? What didn't he want me to find? And then I remembered the attic. The building had a shared attic space, but no one ever used it, or so I thought. Fueled by a mix of dread and determination, I decided to check it out. The attic door was in the hallway just above the stairs leading to his unit. With shaking hands, I pulled the cord to lower the ladder and climbed up. The moment my head breached the opening, the smell hit me. Musty, damp, and something else. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it. Piles of random objects. A pair of sneakers that weren't mine, a stuffed animal that looked eerily familiar, and photos, hundreds of photos. Of me, sitting on my couch, cooking in my kitchen, sleeping in my bed. I immediately called the landlord and the police. They searched his apartment and found something that made my skin crawl. A key to my unit, detailed notes about my daily routine, and similar notes about the other residents in the building. The most horrifying part? His ceiling vent. He had modified it to watch my living room from above. I moved out the next week. To this day, I still get chills thinking about the nights I spent there, unaware of who or what was watching me. It's been years since then, but every time I move into a new place, I check every lock, every vent, every shadow. Because you never know who might be watching. This story isn't just about my experience. It's a reminder to trust your instincts. If something feels off, don't ignore it. Take precautions. Protect yourself. And if you're ever in doubt, just remember, it's better to be cautious than to find out the hard way that you're not alone. It was the quiet that drew me in, but it was the screams that made me regret ever moving in. Living in the city, I thought finding a peaceful place to rent was a miracle. The kind of neighborhood where kids played in the yard, mailboxes stood untouched, and the neighbors, well, they mostly kept to themselves. But sometimes, peace hides something much darker. I learned that the hard way when I met my neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker. Or rather, when she started watching me. I moved into that house 6 months ago. It was a modest place, a little outdated, sure, but nothing I couldn't make work. The first thing I noticed about the neighborhood was how empty it felt. The houses were all lined up perfectly, lawns neatly trimmed, not a single piece of trash on the street. It was too perfect, too quiet. Across the street was Mrs. Whitaker's house. She was always there, sitting by her living room window, staring out at the world like a statue. She never waved, never blinked, just stared. I chalked it up to her being an old widow with too much time on her hands. We've all got that one nosy neighbor, right? The first few weeks were uneventful. She'd watch me leave for work in the morning, watch me come back at night. I tried smiling at her once. She didn't smile back, just stared harder, her face slack and expressionless, like she was trying to memorize every inch of me. Things started getting weird about a month in. It began with small, almost insignificant things. The trash bins I left out by the curb would somehow end up back near my door. Packages on my porch were moved slightly, like someone had inspected them. And at night, I swear I could hear faint tapping on my windows. But when I'd check, nothing was there. One evening, as I was taking the trash out, I noticed something strange in Mrs. Whitaker's yard. She had a garden, if you could call it that, just a patch of dirt with a single twisted tree in the middle. There was no grass, no flowers, just that dead tree surrounded by mounds of earth, as if something or someone was buried there. I tried not to think too much of it. Old people have weird hobbies, right? Maybe she was trying to grow something, but the thought lingered. Then came the night she knocked on my door. It was past midnight. I was halfway through a horror movie when the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost timid, but insistent. I froze. Who knocks on someone's door at this hour? I peeked through the peephole, and there she was, Mrs. Whitaker, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with something I can only describe as desperation. I opened the door a crack. "Mrs. Whitaker, is everything okay?" She didn't answer. Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. She just stared at me, her pupils blown wide, her chest heaving as if she'd been running. "Do you need help?" I asked, uneasy. Finally, she whispered, "Don't let him in." "What? Who?" Her head jerked toward the street. "Him, the man in the hat." I looked outside, but the street was empty. No one was there. When I turned back to her, she was gone. No sign of her, not even a sound of retreating footsteps. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I decided to confront her, to ask what the hell was going on. But when I crossed the street to her house, I found her door slightly ajar. "Mrs. Whitaker?" I called out, stepping inside. The smell hit me first. Something metallic, mixed with decay. The living room was immaculate, just like I imagined. Lace doilies on the furniture, family photos on the walls. But everything felt off. The air was heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. I found her in the kitchen, or rather, what was left of her. Her body was slumped over the table, her eyes wide open, staring straight ahead. Her mouth was stretched into a silent scream, and her hands were clawing at the table as if she'd been trying to hold on to something. On the table was a single piece of paper with 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "He's inside now." I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe I was too scared to think straight. Maybe some part of me needed to know. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet, and crept up the stairs. The hallway was dark, the kind of dark that feels alive, like it's pressing against you. At the end of the hall was a single door, slightly ajar, with a sliver of light spilling out. I pushed the door open with the skillet, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The room was empty, except for the mirror. It was an old, ornate thing leaning against the far wall, and in the reflection, I saw him, the man in the hat. He was tall, impossibly tall, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. His eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and his grin. He wasn't in the room, just in the mirror, until he wasn't. The last thing I remember is the sound of glass shattering and a cold hand grabbing my arm. When I woke up, I was back in my house, lying on the living room floor. The mirror was gone, and so was Mrs. Whitaker. The police never found her body. They said she probably just wandered off, maybe got lost somewhere. But I know better. Every night since, I've kept my blinds closed and my lights on. But sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear it, the faint tapping on my windows. And when I gather the courage to look, there's always a figure standing across the street, staring back at me.